The white mask and black robe have become synonymous with contemporary horror, yet the mythology surrounding this figure extends far beyond modern cinema. This exploration examines the elaborate narrative constructed around an entity that allegedly predates its cinematic incarnation by centuries, transforming a simple slasher icon into something representing primordial human fear itself, manifesting across generations through different hosts and cultural contexts. The mythology begins not in the 1990s but centuries earlier, in isolated villages where records describe an inexplicable presence. Long before cinema, before modern communication technology, reports documented a shadow moving through communities, leaving no physical traces but devastating psychological impact. Entire families disappeared during foggy nights, and survivors spoke of impossible phenomena, voices communicating across distances, conversations occurring through methods that wouldn't exist for centuries. These historical accounts describe not a masked figure but something more disturbing, a presence with no fixed appearance, a blank face that shifted according to observer perception. Some witnesses reported ghostly apparitions, others saw distorted reflections of themselves. This variability suggests the entity functioned as mirror rather than independent form, reflecting back each victim's specific fears and psychological vulnerabilities. The consistency of reports across unconnected regions and time periods creates compelling narrative framework suggesting something beyond simple folklore. According to the mythology, medieval religious orders documented a cult dedicated to understanding and containing this faceless entity. These practitioners believed creating a physical mask provided the only means of interacting with or controlling this force. The white mask wasn't conceived as disguise but as channeling device, sewn with fibers treated in blood, designed to absorb and direct supernatural energy. This transformed the mask from protective barrier into dangerous conduit. The cult members discovered their creation worked too well. The mask didn't contain the entity but rather provided it means of manifestation. Those wearing it believed they maintained control while their consciousness was gradually corrupted. Wearers reported alien thoughts appearing in their minds, commands disguised as internal impulses. Dreams became indistinguishable from reality. Familiar faces appeared begging for help, and upon waking, only one compulsion remained: spreading terror. The mask transformed humans into vessels for something far more ancient and malevolent. The mythology's sophistication lies in identifying fear itself as the primary weapon. Historical accounts describe 19th-century American settlements devastated not by visible killers but by paranoia. With no clear perpetrator, communities turned inward, neighbors suspecting neighbors, families fragmenting under pressure of invisible threat. Deaths rarely came through violence but through panic, madness, and complete social collapse. The entity didn't need to kill directly at orchestrated circumstances where people destroyed themselves and each other. This approach demonstrates psychological insight into how fear operates at community level. Once trust erodes, once suspicion takes root, social structures collapse from within. The entity exploited fundamental human vulnerabilities: our need for security, our tendency toward tribal thinking, our capacity for turning on each other when threatened. The true horror wasn't supernatural but human, revealing how easily civilization's veneer cracks under sustained psychological pressure. The mythology suggests that creating monsters requires only fear and time. The narrative takes metafictional turn by positioning cinema itself as unwitting participant in the entity's resurrection. According to this mythology, when filmmakers created their masked killer character, they didn't invent but rediscovered, recycling an ancient archetype the entity had always inhabited. Every scream in theaters, every Halloween costume purchased, every image circulated through popular culture strengthened the entity. The myth became fuel, collective attention providing energy for something that feeds on fear and remembrance. This framework cleverly exploits audience relationship with horror media. We consume scary content for entertainment, maintaining comfortable distance between fiction and reality. The mythology collapses that distance, suggesting our engagement isn't passive consumption but active participation in something dangerous. Each viewing, each discussion, each reproduction of the image allegedly reinforces the entity's presence. Popular culture becomes ritual by another name, millions unconsciously performing ceremonies that strengthen what they believe they're merely watching. The mythology describes possession as gradual process rather than sudden takeover. It begins with whispers thoughts the host believes originate internally but carry alien origin. These suggestions corrode resistance slowly, preparing consciousness for full infiltration. Then the mask appears, as if it had always been waiting for precisely this moment. Contact proves inevitable and irreversible once initiated. The host convinces themselves they wear the mask voluntarily, for revenge or challenge, while their will has already been compromised. What appears as simple disguise functions as binding contract with the entity. The host thinks they maintain control while the entity guides every movement, every decision, every terrifying action. This loss of agency while maintaining illusion of choice creates particularly disturbing scenario. The mythology suggests the most complete control is that which feels like freedom, where the puppet never realizes they're dancing on strings. The host's personality doesn't disappear but rather becomes instrument played by invisible hands. Scene. Among the mythology's most chilling elements are the phone calls preceding attacks. While they appear as psychological strategy, the mythology posits the voice doesn't belong to the human host but manifests directly from the entity. Each call is tailored precisely to the victim's deepest vulnerabilities, revealing secrets never shared, exposing buried guilt, speaking impossible knowledge. The voice adapts different tones, familiar cadences, sometimes mimicking deceased loved ones or the victim's own voice twisted into unnatural registers. These calls serve multiple functions. They isolate victims psychologically before physical attack, corroding sanity through sustained psychological pressure. They demonstrate the entity's access to consciousness itself, its ability to read and manipulate intimate memories. They transform the mind into battlefield where the real combat occurs long before any physical confrontation. By the time violence arrives, the victim has already been defeated internally, resistance shattered through precision psychological warfare. The body falls only after the mind has been thoroughly consumed. The mythology frames well-known cinematic events, not as fiction but as publicized chapter in ongoing saga. The perpetrators in that narrative presented as calculating masterminds were actually puppets. Vessels already fractured by rage and obsession, perfect candidates for possession. Their fate was sealed before conscious choice entered the equation. The central target wasn't chosen randomly but specifically for her strength and resilience. The entity craves not easy victims but worthy prey, finding greatest satisfaction in breaking those most resistant. This recontextualization of familiar narrative demonstrates the mythology's ambition. It doesn't merely tell separate story but claims to reveal hidden truth beneath known events. Woodsboro becomes just one manifestation in pattern stretching across centuries. Similar incidents occurred throughout history under different names. The specter of Blackwood in 19th century England, the shadow killer in 1950s America. Different eras, different contexts, but identical pattern. Blank-faced presence, random victims, deaths from paranoia rather than violence, communities tearing themselves apart from within. Central to the mythology is reconceptualizing the mask from disguise to transformative artifact. It doesn't hide identity but creates new one, overwriting the host's personality with extension of the entity. Every gesture, every chase, every crime becomes offering, blood spilled as fuel and prolonged terror as reward. This explains the mythology's central mystery, why the figure never truly dies. Hosts may be unmasked, imprisoned, or killed, but the face underneath proves irrelevant. The true creature remains untouched, eternal, lurking between manifestations. The mask functions as trap for both wearer and viewer. It absorbs vital energy from hosts while serving as focal point for collective attention. The fabric isn't mere cloth but portal, allowing the entity to shape reality around it. Witnesses report impossible phenomena, objects moving autonomously, shadows behaving contrary to light, victims feeling hunted even in crowds. The mask's presence distorts natural law, creating localized reality where the entity's rules apply. Nowhere becomes truly safe because the threat exists as much in consciousness as physical space. Ikti. The entity allegedly chooses hosts with surgical precision, seeking not innocents but those already marked by trauma, rage, or profound loneliness. Broken people require only slight push to tumble into abyss. Within emotional voids, the mask finds perfect accommodation. The process unfolds gradually: initial relief when wearing the mask, as if finally discovering purpose, then growing compulsion towards stalking and ritual terror. Soon the host cannot distinguish their thoughts from whispered commands. The cruelty extends beyond physical violence to prolonged psychological torture, savoring every drop of despair. This selection pattern reveals sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The entity doesn't create darkness but amplifies existing shadows, finding fertile ground in existing pain and transforming it into something monstrous. This raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility and agency. Are possessed hosts victims or perpetrators? The mythology suggests both. Simultaneously, they carry genuine pain, deserving sympathy while committing inexcusable acts. This ambiguity prevents simple moral categorization, forcing engagement with complexity rather than comfortable condemnation. Criminologists might explain the voice as psychological tactic, but the mythology positions it as supernatural phenomenon. Victims describe tones adapted to each call, as if the entity accessed most intimate memories. Some swore they heard deceased loved ones, others their own voice impossibly twisted. This capability reveals the mask as more than disguise its portal, granting access to consciousness itself, allowing the entity to shape perception and reality according to its purposes. The voice doesn't merely threaten but dismantles psychological defenses with precision impossible for normal human understanding. Communities struck by manifestations rarely recover even after hosts are captured. Paranoia persists, neighbors distrust each other, families disintegrate, and silence becomes enforced norm. The mythology suggests the entity's presence never fully dissipates. Fear continues, haunting those streets indefinitely. This lasting damage demonstrates the entity's true power, not merely killing individuals but poisoning entire social ecosystems. Trust, once broken, proves nearly impossible to fully restore. The entity's greatest victory isn't body count but sustained destruction of human connection and community cohesion. The mythology takes ironic turn by identifying media coverage and entertainment as unwitting accomplices. Sensational headlines, films, and costumes transformed the figure into pop culture icon, but such popularity carries dark price. Every casual wearing of the mask as joke provides new cracks for manifestation. Investigators warn the figure isn't individual killer but cycle-spanning eras and borders. Wherever collective pain exists, wherever communities carry grief and secrets, the mask returns. It's not merely symbol of fear but fear itself, given form and consciousness. The real danger lies in believing it's only fiction, precisely the deception the entity desires. While the world laughs, dresses up, and consumes the image, the entity grows stronger, unseen. With every trivial scare, new hosts are prepared. When least expected, the mask breathes again. This creates disturbing feedback loop, where the very mechanisms we use to process and contain fear turning it into entertainment. Making it safe through fiction actually strengthen what we're trying to neutralize. Our defenses become our vulnerabilities. Exploge. The mythology references undisclosed records of families vanishing after events linked to the mask. Houses remained intact, doors locked, yet residents disappeared without trace. Investigators found only sketches of blank faces on walls, as if occupants tried reproducing the entity's visage before vanishing. Survivor diaries reveal patterns, silent phone calls preceding attacks, footsteps in empty hallways, sensation of constant surveillance. Psychological isolation precedes physical violence. First the mind breaks, then the body is hunted. This pattern, meticulous psychological preparation followed by physical attack, demonstrates methodical intelligence rather than random violence. The entity doesn't merely kill but conducts elaborate rituals, where terror itself is the primary product and death merely byproduct. Victims weakened by sustained fear can no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. At this breaking point, when resistance has crumbled, the figure strikes. The scream that erupts comes from consciousness already thoroughly defeated, body following mind into destruction. The mythology's philosophical depth emerges in suggesting the entity reflects humanity itself, or thirst for violence, our obsession with fear, our capacity for cruelty. The blank face represents not external other, but internal emptiness waiting within each of us for opportunity to surface. Cinema helped camouflage this truth by turning horror into entertainment, creating smokescreen where audiences laugh, scream, and consume without realizing they feed what the mask symbolizes. Laughter disguises dread but never cancels it. On contrary, it strengthens it through sustained engagement and collective attention. Some hosts confessed memory gaps during crimes, describing watching themselves from outside their bodies. This dissociation proves they never maintained full control. They were puppets guided by invisible hands. Victims reported inexplicable phenomena, electronics activating spontaneously, mirrors reflecting wrong faces, shadows defying light. These details suggest the entity transcends physical form, existing equally in psychic space, distorting reality by seeping into consciousness's smallest corners until completely dominated. The figure doesn't need physical presence to exist. Belief suffices. Fear suffices. Occult researchers within the mythology claim the entity cannot be destroyed, only contained. The mask allegedly functions as seal channeling and trapping the force, yet someone always proves willing to wear it from curiosity, vengeance, or despair. When they do, the seal breaks and the cycle begins anew. With each manifestation, the entity grows more sophisticated. Past iterations relied on whispers and shadows. Modern versions exploit technology as weapon, phone calls, distorted recordings, anonymous digital messages. It adapts to contemporary context, reinventing methods of entering minds while maintaining essential nature unchanged. This adaptability explains its endurance across centuries and cultures. The entity never manifests identically twice, always introducing variations and new details, as if experimenting with terror methods. Yet one feature remains constant: the blank white face, its inevitable signature across time and geography. Scholars within the mythology theorize the entity's true identity isn't who, but what, a primitive force born from human psyche itself, with collective fear as sustenance. Each era provides new mask, new story, ensuring its survival through cultural evolution. What distinguishes this figure from other horror icons is universal accessibility. It can inhabit anyone, neighbor, colleague, family member. No limits of age, gender, or status apply. Only fragile mind is required, providing open door for infiltration. This universality explains permanence. Regardless of time or place, pain, secrets, and guilt persist. In every society scarred by these elements, the figure can resurface not as legend but as presence wearing flesh of yet another vulnerable host. The crimes most associated with this mythology proved this to the world. What seemed like cruel game was actually modern reenactment of ancient ritual. The mask circulates, changing hands, but essence never shifts. As long as fear exists, the entity exists, not temporarily but permanently. Cinema ironically amplified its power through mass distribution. Millions laughed and screamed at the masked figure, unaware their engagement fed the entity itself. It survives through remembrance. Every mention, every costume, every scream on screen provides another feast for the faceless shadow. This elaborate mythology demonstrates horror's capacity for exploring human psychology and collective fear through supernatural framework. Whether interpreted as pure fiction, cultural metaphor, or something darker, the story resonates by addressing genuine anxieties about identity, violence, and fear's role in human experience. For mature audiences capable of engaging with complex themes, it offers rich material for contemplating how communities create and perpetuate their own terrors. The masked figure endures because it represents something fundamental about human nature: our capacity for violence, our vulnerability to fear, our tendency toward destroying what we don't understand. The blank face serves as a mirror reflecting our own darkness back at us. The mythology's power lies in suggesting the monster isn't external but internal, that the real horror lives within human consciousness, waiting for circumstances that allow it to manifest. In recognizing this uncomfortable truth, perhaps we can understand how fear operates and find ways to resist its most destructive influences. The mask may be eternal, but awareness offers hope that understanding its nature might weaken its grip on collective consciousness. The entity survives through belief stop believing, and perhaps we finally break the cycle that spans centuries.